Continue with E.M. Bounds, and here's his quote. Faith is not a simple agreement of the understanding and will, or a passive belief in facts, no matter how sacred or thorough. So it's not just a man-sided approach. Faith is an operation of God, a divine illumination, a holy energy planted by the Word of God and the Spirit in the human soul. It is a spiritual, divine principle that takes from the supernatural and makes it an understandable thing by the faculties of time and sense. And of course, E.M. Bounds, as we've stated before in the previous recording, was a Methodist, not a Calvinist. So this is not monergism, but it is a focus, as Wesley's was, on the divine origin of this work. Asbury Lowry best distinguishes between God's part in giving this faith and man's part in appropriating it. Touching the origin of faith, there are two opposite beliefs. Some writers have taken the position that faith is an exclusive and arbitrary gift of God. That would be the Calvinists of the past. Others, by consequence, have leaned to the opposite extreme, and I would say that's Dunning and Wynkoop, and represented faith as the independent act of man. It will be easy to show that both of these propositions involve error, and that the truth lies at the mean distance between these polemic poles, and that's where Wesley stood. The Scriptures clearly teach that faith is in part the gift of God, and in part the exercise of a free and responsible agent. The power to believe is of God. The appropriation and use of that power is the work of the suppliant, whether a penitent sinner or a seeker of holiness. And it is quite evident that without the inspiration of power giving to the mind believing biases, no man would and no man could reverse the unbelieving tendencies of his nature and repose faith in God through Christ for salvation from sin. Very powerful point there that he added at the end, that man could not believe for himself, as Wesley said. While H. Horton Wiley agrees that faith is the instrument of justification, which is how I like to emphasize it, Wiley instead preferred to entitle it the conditional cause. He quotes Adam Clarke in a point where, though he sounds similar to Lowry before quoted, he moves away from Wesley by making the act of faith at some point entirely a man's own. In an effort to distance himself from Calvinistic monergism, leading to predeterminism, Clarke too easily bifurcates between God's part and man's part, the grace by which it is produced and the act of believing, as he stated it, even to the point that he can then errantly state that the, quote, the power to believe for salvation may be present long before it's exercised. He bases this on the solemn warnings and threatenings the Word of God gives to those who do not believe. On this issue, both Wiley and Clarke before him sound as if prevenient grace, God's part, slowly charges up man's own natural constitution or capacity to full power so that then he can alone exercise his faith. This statement of Clarke's inadvertently opens the door for gradualism. If the grace necessary to this act of faith is given long before it's exercised, and not only at the moment when the recipient is ready to exercise it, and that's the stress I would make, it's only given at that moment, as Wesley taught. God, by giving this faith in that moment, does not overrun man's part, but enables or works with him to freely act. This more orthodox point stands in line with Wesley's argument that people sin not because they do not have grace, meaning prevenient grace leading to consecration, but because they do not use the grace that is theirs, which is full consecration, so that more grace could be extended to them in that same moment in order to believe. God does not bestow this living faith, a different faith because qualitatively saving, upon unbelieving individuals until they are fully prepared to exercise it. The problem is, if Wiley is right, and then what then happens to Wesley's descriptions that God gave this faith, that to be exercised at that crisis moment by man like lightning from heaven? Wesley wrote of the unconverted in 1739, and you'll see me kind of use these truths across the board from the unregenerate experience to the sanctified, because faith works the same way in bringing them to Christ and in bringing them to entire sanctification.